The room was already thick with tension when Elon Musk leaned forward, cutting across Jasmine Crockett's words with the impatience of someone used to being heard above all others. "That's not true. Let me explain." His voice, sharp and insistent, ricocheted against the chamber walls. Cameras zoomed in instantly, hungry for the clash that had been building all afternoon. Crockett paused, not with the rattled energy of someone silenced, but with the calm composure of a woman who has learned the power of patience. She fixed her gaze directly on Musk, her lips pressed together in a knowing restraint. The audience could sense it. She wasn't shaken. She was calculating. Musk, emboldened, tried again, his words tumbling out in quick succession. He gestured broadly, interrupting as if his wealth and status alone granted him the authority to dominate every conversation. Each interjection landed like a hammer, loud, heavy, determined to crush the rhythm of Crockett's thoughts. Viewers at home felt the arrogance radiating through the screen, and murmurs spread across the chamber as some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Yet Crockett remained still, her silence louder than Musk's noise. Every interruption only magnified the contrast, his restlessness versus her control. For every second he pushed, she waited. For every attempt he made to silence her, she let the weight of his disrespect hang in the air, allowing the audience to judge for themselves who truly held the moral authority in that moment. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance began to shift. Musk's interruptions, once commanding, started to sound defensive, more like a man scrambling to secure dominance than one confidently holding it. Meanwhile, Crockett's stillness took on the feel of a gathering storm. Spectators leaned in, sensing that something was brewing just beneath her steady exterior. The cameras captured her eyes narrowing, her chin lifting slightly, as if she knew the exact moment to strike had not yet arrived, but soon would. And then in that silence after Musk's seventh interruption, Crockett finally inhaled, a calm breath that carried the promise of reckoning. The room seemed to brace itself, because no one had to understand why this clash mattered. You have to see beyond the surface, beyond one billionaire interrupting one congresswoman. What played out in that chamber was not just a personal dispute. It was the embodiment of two Americas colliding in full view of the world. On one side stood Elon Musk, the symbol of towering wealth, a man whose empire stretches from satellites to self-driving cars. A man accustomed to bending conversations, markets, even governments to his will. On the other side was Jasmine Crockett, a public servant whose rise came not from inherited power, but from relentless struggle, persistence, and the deep conviction that truth must never be drowned out by arrogance. This wasn't merely a heated exchange. It was a mirror held up to America itself. Musk's interruptions carried more than impatience. They carried entitlement, the assumption that his voice would always be the loudest in the room. Silence, her restraint, carried something far heavier. The responsibility of every citizen who has been talked over, ignored, dismissed, yet refused to give in. Consider Musk's history, time and again, in interviews, in public forums, in private boardrooms. He has dominated the conversation, not only with intellect, but with sheer force of personality. Journalists cut off mid-question, co-founders edged. Out of their own companies, critics steamrolled by his relentless need to have the final word. For years, this strategy worked. People tolerated it, excused it, even admired it as part of his genius. But here, in this moment, was facing a congresswoman who had spent her life speaking for those without the luxury of interruption. Because Crockett represented something Musk could not buy, credibility forged in service. Her fight was never about stock prices or rockets. It was about fairness, dignity, and the lived experiences of millions who had been silenced too many times. The chamber could feel that weight, even if Musk couldn't. His 7 interruptions weren't just rudeness. They were the physical manifestation, privilege crashing into resistance. And what made this moment electric, what made it impossible for anyone to look away, was the knowledge that Crockett was holding something back. She wasn't silenced. She wasn't beaten. She was building towards something. You could see it in her composure, the way she absorbed each interruption, like a boxer letting the opponent tire himself out. Each jab Musk threw was exhausting his credibility, each interjection eroding the illusion of control he thought he commanded. The tension in the room was unbearable, because everyone sensed the inevitable. Crockett wasn't going to remain silent forever. She was going to respond, and when she did, it wouldn't just be another counterpoint. It would be a reckoning. The interruptions weren't random. They revealed something deeper. They revealed Musk's fear of losing control, his inability to face a voice he couldn't simply buy off or shout down. And Crockett, steady and unbroken, was about to expose that truth in a way that no camera, no social media spin, no carefully crafted press release could erase. What happened next would not just shift the room. It would ripple far beyond those walls, into the feeds of millions, into the conversations at kitchen tables, into the very heart of the question: who truly deserves to be heard in America? Room expected what would happen when she finally got her turn. Elon Musk is no stranger to the spotlight. For years, he has commanded it, sometimes earned, sometimes sees, crafting an image of the restless innovator who bends the future to his will. He is the man who turned PayPal into a global payment force, who dared to launch rockets into orbit when governments scoffed, who branded electric cars not as sacrifices but as symbols of luxury and aspiration. Musk has always been framed as a visionary, a genius who sees what others cannot. But alongside the brilliance lies a shadow. For every bold innovation, there has been an arrogance just as towering. His dismissive remarks toward regulators, journalists, colleagues, and critics form a trail as long as his list of accomplishments. When the rescue of Thai school children trapped in a cave transfixed the world, Musk offered a hastily built submarine. When divers questioned its usefulness, his response was not humility, but insult branding, one a pedo guy and a reckless. Outbursts that revealed more about Musk's unchecked ego than his supposed generosity. The case was thrown into the courts, but the stain on his character was harder to erase. In interviews, his interruptions are legendary. Journalists barely finish their questions before Musk steamrolls over them, pivoting to whatever message he wishes to project. Employees describe meetings where ideas were swatted away with sarcastic quips, where dissent was treated not as collaboration, but as betrayal. He has mocked pronouns, dismissed unions, and weaponized Twitter now, akin to a megaphone where critics are drowned in waves of his followers' vitriol. For all his talk of free speech, it has often meant freedom for him to speak, and punishment for those who dared speak back. And yet for so long he seemed untouchable. His genius shielded him. People excused his arrogance as the eccentricity of a man who dared to dream bigger than most. When stock prices soared, when rockets landed themselves on floating barges, when governments bent over backwards to court Tesla factories, the arrogance was tolerated because the results dazzled. Musk built an aura of inevitability. He was the future, and to challenge him was to challenge progress itself. But genius without accountability corrodes. Musk's contradictions became harder to ignore. Preached sustainability while cozying up to fossil fuel interests. He touted innovation while silencing critics. He spoke of making life multiplanetary, while struggling with the most basic responsibilities on Earth: worker safety, responsible leadership, respect for truth. The cracks in the myth grew wider, and suddenly the world began to see not just the innovator, but the emperor in his own echo chamber. And here, in this chamber, in this confrontation with Jasmine Crockett, those contradictions crystallized into human form. Musk wasn't just interrupting. He was embodying a pattern that had defined his career. Dismiss first, dominate second. Deflect always. It was the reflex of a man who had rarely been forced to reckon with the possibility that someone else's voice might matter more than his own. For the first time, however, the tactic didn't land as it once did. Crockett didn't scramble, didn't flinch, didn't retreat. With each interruption, Musk's insistence began to look less like confidence and more like insecurity. Very strategy that had made him feared in boardrooms and admired by tech loyalists was unraveling before an audience of millions. He was no longer the genius in control of the future. He was the arrogant mogul grasping for dominance in the present, and that's why the stakes of this clash felt so monumental. If Musk could silence Crockett, it would reinforce the myth that wealth and power always dictate whose voice matters most. But if he couldn't, if his arrogance met its match, then the moment would mark something far larger than a debate. It would signal a crack in the armor of untouchable privilege, because for all his influence, for all his empire, Musk had finally encountered resistance that his fortune, his platforms, and his arrogance could not bulldoze. The genius had met accountability, and the unchecked ego was finally being checked. But Crockett's past had uniquely prepared her for this battle, before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in that chamber. Before the cameras and the headlines, she had lived a story that made her more than ready for a moment like this. Unlike the billionaire across from her, Crockett's life was not cushioned by extraordinary wealth or privilege. Hers was built brick by brick, case by case. Through a lifetime of standing with those who had no one else to fight for them, she began as a lawyer. Not in the glamorous high-rises of corporate America, but in courtrooms where the fluorescent lights flickered, where families sat trembling over the fate of loved ones, where justice often felt like a privilege instead of a right. Crockett carved her name in those rooms by defending the defenseless, by taking on cases others wouldn't touch. She became known not for chasing profit, but for chasing principle. Every late night poring over case files, every exhausted morning walking into court, was fueled by a simple conviction: that dignity must not depend on wealth. Her clients were often those written off by society: immigrants without resources, the working poor with no safety net, families crushed by systems designed to favor the powerful. Crockett did more than argue their cases. She carried their stories into spaces that were not built for them. She spoke with a clarity that judges couldn't ignore, and with a fire that juries couldn't forget. That work hardened her. It taught her to keep her composure when others tried to talk over her. It taught her that silence can be louder than shouting, that patience can be sharper than any insult. This resilience followed her into politics. Crockett didn't run for office to climb a ladder. She ran because she saw how laws written far from the lives of ordinary people often determined whether those people thrived or suffered. Her campaign was fueled not by billion-dollar donations, but by neighbors, by small-dollar contributions, by communities who recognized in her someone who had lived their struggles. She wasn't just a candidate. She was a vessel for voices long ignored. When she entered Congress, she carried with her that courtroom toughness and that grassroots authenticity. She was unafraid to challenge those who held more power, unafraid to confront arrogance, unafraid to stand firm when others would bow. Unlike so many who polished themselves into bland sound bites, Crockett spoke with unvarnished clarity, with a rhythm and fire that reminded people she wasn't there for theater, she was there for truth. And in an era when truth itself is often treated like a negotiable currency, that made her dangerous to those who preferred to dominate through distortion, her composure was not passive. It was forged through struggle. Every time she held her ground against a sneer in a courtroom, every time she endured the subtle dismissals in political meetings, every time she refused to shrink when others assumed she should, she was building the armor that Musk's interruptions would bounce against. He came armed with wealth, status, and a voice that had silenced so many before. But Crockett came armed with something sharper: experience, resilience, and the credibility of a life spent serving others instead of herself. And for the audience watching, that difference mattered. They saw not just a Congresswoman, but a reflection of themselves. The worker whose ideas were dismissed in meetings, the student whose questions were brushed aside, the immigrant whose story was cut off before it could be told. Crockett's calm was their calm. Her patience was their patience. Her silence in the face of arrogance was their silence made visible, dignified and unbroken. It is this emotional bond that made the moment so much larger than a clash of personalities. Musk represented unchecked power. Crockett represented the insistence that truth still has a place in public life, that dignity can still hold its own against dismissal. She wasn't just holding her ground for herself. She was holding it for every person who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. And that's why the anticipation built with every interruption. Crockett wasn't rattled, wasn't scrambling. She was waiting because she knew timing mattered more than volume. She had learned in courtrooms that the most devastating blow is the one delivered at the precise moment, when the opposition is weakest, when arrogance has peaked, when silence falls heavy enough to amplify truth. So as Musk interrupted her again and again, as he leaned on the same tactics that had silenced so many before, Crockett remained calm, not because she was powerless, but because she understood power in a way Musk never could. True power wasn't in wealth or dominance. It was in patience, in precision, in knowing that the right words, spoken at the right moment, could reverberate louder than 1,000 interruptions. So when Musk tried to steamroll her, she had the perfect weapon: her words. ChatGPT said. The clash intensified with every passing minute. Musk leaned forward in his chair, his tone sharp, his interruptions more frequent, as if volume and persistence alone could secure his dominance. Wait, no, that's not accurate. Let me stop you right there. You don't understand the numbers. The phrases piled up, each delivered with a touch of impatience that revealed less confidence than irritation. By the time he cut her off for the 4th time, the rhythm of the exchange no longer resembled a debate. It looked like an attempt to bulldoze. Crockett, however, did not rise to the bait. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't let her voice crack with frustration. Instead, she sat poised, her hands steady, her breathing even. Each interruption, rather than throwing her off balance, became a brick Musk laid in the wall of his own arrogance. She simply waited, letting him expend his energy. If he believed dominance was measured in decibels, she was determined to prove that true strength was measured in control. By the 5th interruption, the audience began to notice. Murmurs spread across the chamber. A few exchanged knowing glances, as though they recognized the imbalance. One man grasping desperately to hold the floor, one woman refusing to give it away. Cameras caught the subtle reactions: raised eyebrows, folded arms, the small smirks of onlookers who understood they were witnessing a slow unraveling. When the 6th interruption came, Musk's voice carried a sharper edge, tinged with frustration. He repeated himself, circling back to points he had already made, as though sheer repetition would make them irrefutable. The repetition betrayed him. What was once perceived as confidence now looked increasingly like insecurity. The more he cut her off, the smaller his arguments became, shrinking under the weight of his own insistence. And yet Crockett never rushed to break through. She let him dominate the sound while she dominated the silence. The patience she carried was no accident. It was strategy. Like a courtroom litigator who knows the jury is watching. She understood that sometimes the most devastating response is the one delivered last, when the audience is starved for balance. By the 7th interruption, tension filled the room like static before a storm. Even those who had initially tuned in for entertainment leaned forward, sensing something greater was unfolding. Side eyes darted across the chamber. A few shook their heads, unimpressed by Musk's performance. And somewhere in that building anticipation, the crowd's allegiance began to shift. Musk had the microphone, but Crockett had the room. Her composure became its own spectacle. With every calm glance, every unshaken breath, she transformed Musk's interruptions into evidence against him. She did not need to raise her voice or match his aggression. She only needed to wait until the weight of his arrogance collapsed under its own force. And then, as the noise settled after his 7th interjection, Crockett adjusted her papers, lifted her head, and prepared to speak. The silence that followed was different, charged, expectant, heavy with the feeling that something decisive was about to break. The cameras tightened their focus. The murmurs quieted. Even Musk, for all his bluster, seemed momentarily aware that his dominance had reached its limit, and then on her 8th point the entire atmosphere changed. The chamber had grown restless after Musk's 7th interruption, his words echoing in the air with diminishing returns. Then came that pause, the kind of silence that swallows the room whole, the kind of silence that promises something seismic. Jasmine Crockett lifted her eyes from her notes, folded her hands calmly, and let the stillness linger just long enough to reclaim control. "Are you finished, Mr. Musk?" she asked, her voice steady, deliberate, almost too quiet for a man used to commanding noise. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room. Musk shifted in his seat, his face taut, a half-smile masking his irritation. He didn't answer. He didn't need to, everyone already knew. The floor was hers. Crockett leaned in slightly, her voice carrying with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed this moment her entire life, even if she hadn't planned it. You've interrupted me 7 times now. 7 times you decided that your voice mattered more than mine. 7 times you tried to cut short a point you didn't want to hear. She paused, letting each 7 hang in the air like the tolling of a bell. Eyes in the chamber darted toward Musk, whose forced composure cracked with the faintest twitch of his jaw. But here's the thing, she continued, her cadence tightening, her words flowing like a blade sharpened on steel. Every time you interrupt, you reveal something. You reveal that you're not listening. You reveal that you believe wealth grants you authority over truth, and you reveal that for all your talk about freedom, you cannot stand the freedom of a woman, a black woman. To finish her sentence, gasps broke out from the back of the chamber. Musk's lips parted slightly, as if to protest, but no words came. The camera zoomed in on him, his silence suddenly louder than his interruptions had ever been. Crockett pressed on. You say you want to shape the future. You say you believe in innovation, in big ideas. But the future isn't built on interruptions. The future is built on respect, on dignity, on the recognition that genius without humility is nothing more than arrogance dressed up in shiny packaging. Musk's eyes darted to the crowd, then back to his lap, his fingers drumming nervously against the table. For a man who had dominated boardrooms and headlines, this was uncharted territory. He was no longer the disruptor. He was the disrupted. Crockett slowed her pace, her voice growing softer, more intimate, as if she were speaking not just to Musk, but to everyone who had ever been silenced. I've spent my life in rooms where people like me weren't supposed to have a voice. I've seen clients dismissed, ignored, talked over, because their names weren't famous and their bank accounts weren't deep. I learned that silence is not weakness. Silence is strategy. And I waited, Mr. Musk. I waited for this moment for the 8th time to remind you. And everyone watching, that respect is not optional. The chamber erupted in applause. Not polite, not restrained, but thunderous. Even those who had sat stone-faced moments earlier were now leaning forward, clapping, nodding, swept into the force of her delivery. Musk, uncharacteristically, did not interrupt. He sat back, his face rigid. His voice caught somewhere between his pride and his inability to reclaim the ground he had lost. Crockett raised her hand slightly, the applause fading as she delivered her closing strike. So let me finish my 8th point. The one you tried so hard to stop. Power without accountability is corruption. An interruption without listening? That is weakness, pretending to be strength. And in America, in this chamber, weakness will never silence truth. The last word rang out, clean and final, and for a heartbeat, there was nothing but the hum of cameras capturing the moment. Musk blinked, his mouth opening as if to respond, but nothing came. For perhaps the first time in his career, he had no comeback, no quip, no retort, just silence. That silence was the sound of a man disarmed. A titan cut down not by volume or wealth, but by the precision of dignity wielded like a weapon. Crockett had done what few thought possible. She had rendered Elon Musk speechless. The crowd knew it. The chamber knew it. And soon the entire world would know it. Because the internet didn't just notice, it exploded, the moment Crockett's final words landed. The chamber erupted, but the real aftershocks began. The instant clips hit the internet. Within minutes, Twitter, Musk's own platform, was ablaze. Hashtags like hashtag Crockett clap back, hashtag let her finish, and the devastatingly blunt hashtag Musk silence trended worldwide. The irony was irresistible. On the very site Musk had purchased to amplify his own voice, his silence became the loudest sound. TikTok was merciless. Edits of Crockett's 8th point spread like wildfire. Set 2 cinematic soundtracks, slow-motion replays, and captions that screamed poetic justice. One viral edit looped Musk's failed interruptions 7 times in quick succession, before freezing on Crockett's.com, steady expression as she delivered the line that broke him. The caption read, 7 tries. 1 truth. Game over. Millions liked and shared it in less than 24 hours. Memes followed close behind. Images of Musk staring blankly into the air were spliced into mock movie posters. The silence of the mogul. Screenshots of Crockett with her hand raised became digital rallying cries. Let her finish. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist, joking that Musk had finally discovered the one thing he couldn't engineer an interruption-proof Crockett. But it wasn't just jokes. Commentators across the spectrum weighed in. Journalists noted how rare it was to see Musk, usually the disruptor, disrupted. Editorials praised Crockett's patience as a masterclass in rhetorical timing. Civil rights activists hailed her as a new model of composure under fire. Proof that dignity still had a place in American discourse. Even celebrities who rarely touched politics chimed in, reposting the clip with captions like "Queen behavior" and "This is how you handle arrogance." The ripple effect extended into households, workplaces, classrooms. Teachers used the clip to spark discussions about respect and dialogue. Workers passed it around in group chats as vindication for every meeting where they'd been talked over. Immigrants and women of color in particular flooded Crockett's social media with messages of thanks, saying her composure spoke directly to their own lived experiences. Crockett's mentions became a flood of gratitude, her follower count skyrocketing overnight. Meanwhile, Musk's defenders scrambled. Some tried to spin his silence as gracious restraint, others mocked the coverage as overblown. But no matter how hard they tried, the image of a silenced Musk had already burned into the public imagination. For once, his usual army of online supporters could not drown out the narrative. The momentum was too strong, too organic, too resonant. And that's what made this moment historic. It wasn't just a viral clip, it was a cultural shift. Crockett became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that arrogance could be met with composure. That money could not always buy the last word. In the public consciousness, the showdown transformed into a parable. One voice representing unchecked privilege, the other representing dignity and truth, as Crockett herself scrolled through the storm of hashtags and edits. She must have realized that her words were no longer hers alone. They belonged to the millions who had shared, liked, commented, and whispered. Finally, Musk may have built rockets and cars, but Crockett had built something far less tangible and far more enduring. A moment of collective validation. But Crockett didn't just win the moment, she reframed the entire debate. Then the dust settled. What lingered wasn't just the image of Elon Musk normally untouchable, unflappable, unchallenged, sitting in stunned silence. What lingered was the lesson etched into the air. Arrogance collapses when faced with unshakable dignity. Crockett had done more than silence a billionaire. She had reminded the world of something both simple and profound. The truth is not measured in net worth or stock valuations, but in the weight of words grounded in integrity. She didn't shout, didn't grandstand, didn't match interruption with interruption. She let patience sharpen her point until it landed with surgical precision. And when it did, the room shifted. Observers couldn't help but notice how stark the contrast had become. On one side stood Musk, a man who had built rockets, reshaped industries, and commanded digital empires, yet found himself diminished by his own impatience, his own refusal to listen. On the other stood Crockett, a public servant whose strength came not from fortune or fame, but from service, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to representing those too often silenced. The message crystallized. Arrogance may dominate the microphone for a time, but dignity writes the final line. Truth may be interrupted again and again, but when it finally breaks through, it resonates louder than any billionaire's bluster. And it resonated because it wasn't just Crockett's moment, it was everyone's. Every immigrant who had been told their story didn't matter. Every woman who had been cut off in a meeting. Every worker who had been talked over by someone with more status. Crockett stood in that chamber as their proxy, proving that calm persistence could outlast arrogance, and that words rooted in justice could silence even the most powerful voice in the room by the time the clip had circled the globe. People weren't replaying it just to see Musk falter. They were replaying it to see themselves reflected in Crockett's poise, to feel, even for a moment, that dignity could triumph over dismissal. This wasn't just Crockett versus Musk. It was dignity versus arrogance, truth versus power. And in that chamber, with the world watching, dignity won. Her closing words became more than a rebuttal. They became a mirror, reflecting back to America the values it claims to hold highest: fairness, respect, perseverance. They became a reminder that progress is made not only by those who shout the loudest, but by those who hold steady when the noise is deafening, and deliver truth when it matters most. For Musk, the moment will be remembered as one of rare silence. For Crockett, it will be remembered as the night she rose from representative to symbol, from voice in the room to voice of a movement. And for everyone who watched, it was a promise, no matter how loud arrogance tries to be. Dignity always has the last word. 7 interruptions. 1 truth. That was all it took. Musk's attempts to dominate the floor, one after another, ended in silence when confronted with Crockett's 8th and final point. And that silence spoke louder than all his interruptions combined. What this moment revealed is bigger than a single debate. It's about what kind of voices we want amplified in our public square. Do we reward chaos, arrogance, and noise? Or do we lift up composure, dignity, and truth? Jasmine Crockett's calm strength gave us a glimpse of what's possible when we refuse to be rattled by power and insist on being. Her daughter victory wasn't measured in decibels. It was measured in clarity. In that chamber, she proved that composure can outshine disruption, that integrity can eclipse ego, and that one well-placed truth can silence even the loudest billionaire. And now, it's up to us to carry that message forward. Because moments like this don't just belong to Crockett, they belong to everyone who's ever been told to stay quiet, to wait their turn, to accept dismissal as their destiny. Together, we can make sure those voices are not only heard, but celebrated. So here's the call. Subscribe if you believe dignity should always defeat arrogance. Share this story if you've ever felt the power of standing firm against those who tried to silence you. And most importantly, be part of the movement that amplifies voices like hers. Voices that remind us what real leadership looks like. Because in the end, it wasn't just Crockett versus Musk. It was composure versus chaos. Truth versus power. And this time, dignity won.